Michael Mick O'Connor and Jason Jace Byrne were more than just rivals. They were the heartbeat of Liverpool's darkest cocaine war. As their families clashed over control of the city's booming drug trade, the streets became a battleground stained with betrayal, blood, and broken loyalties. This is the story of how two legacies ignited a violent saga that changed Liverpool forever. In the early 2000s, Liverpool was a city on the edge of change. Once known for its bustling docks and rich history, the city now faced economic struggles that left many communities desperate and vulnerable. It was during this time that cocaine began to pour into the city in unprecedented amounts, creating new opportunities for those willing to risk everything. The drug quickly found its way into the hands of local gangs, and soon, what started as small-time deals turned into a booming, dangerous business. The cocaine trade promised fast money and power, but it demanded ruthless control. Two major factions emerged, each led by families who had long been involved in Liverpool's criminal underworld. These families had built their influence slowly, using old connections and street smarts passed down through generations. Now they saw cocaine as their ticket to dominance, controlling entire neighborhoods and deciding who could sell where. Their power wasn't just about money, it was about control, respect, and survival. The arrival of cocaine transformed the city's streets into battlegrounds. What had once been quiet neighborhoods became centers of tension and fear. The gangs were organized, ruthless, and fiercely protective of their territories. Their operations went beyond simple drug sales. They ran complex networks involving importation, distribution, and enforcement. This was no longer just about selling drugs. It was about controlling the city's economy from the shadows. For many young people in Liverpool, the cocaine trade became a tempting escape from poverty and limited opportunities. Joining a gang meant money, status, and a sense of belonging, even if it came with great danger. But with every deal made and every street corner controlled, the risks grew higher. Violence simmered beneath the surface, waiting to explode. As the cocaine trade flourished, so did the stakes. The two families began to see each other not just as rivals, but as threats to their very existence. What started as a profitable business quickly spiraled into a violent struggle for power. The white lines of cocaine on Liverpool's streets would soon be stained with red. A violent saga was about to unfold. The peace that once held Liverpool's neighborhoods together shattered quickly as the cocaine trade grew more intense. The city's streets, once places where families lived and children played, became front lines in a brutal war between rival gangs. Each faction was determined to control as much territory as possible, and this fierce competition ignited violent turf wars that left the community living in constant fear. The gangs didn't just fight for small patches of land, they fought for entire neighborhoods, important drug routes, and key distribution points that could guarantee steady profits. Control over these areas meant more than money. It meant power and influence that reached into every corner of the city. The boundaries between one gang's territory and another's became invisible lines marked by danger and violence. Crossing those lines could cost a life. The battles were ruthless. Drive-by shootings, stabbings, and bomb attacks became everyday realities. Innocent people often found themselves caught in the crossfire, victims of violence they never wanted or deserved. Local businesses were targeted if owners refused to cooperate or pay protection money, turning once thriving areas into ghost towns. Fear spread, and communities felt trapped between the gangs and the law. As the violence escalated, both sides used brutal tactics to intimidate their rivals. Public acts of violence served as warnings to anyone who dared challenge their control. These brutal displays weren't random, they were calculated moves designed to spread fear and assert dominance. The gangs understood that violence was a language everyone on the streets could understand. The rivalry wasn't just about business, it was personal. Old grudges and family loyalties fueled the fire, making peace seem impossible. Leaders pushed their followers to be ruthless, rewarding those who proved their loyalty with money and status, while punishing any sign of weakness or betrayal. The line between friend and enemy blurred, and trust became a rare commodity. By the mid-2000s, Liverpool was a city divided, with red-stained streets marking the violent struggle for power. The turf wars showed no signs of ending, and every day brought new threats and dangers. What began as a fight over drugs had turned into a brutal war that would change Liverpool forever. In the dangerous world of Liverpool's cocaine trade, loyalty was more than just a word, it was a matter of life and death. Gangs operated like tight-knit families where trust was everything. Those who pledged loyalty to their leaders were promised protection and rewards. But betrayal was met with swift and merciless punishment. The stakes were high, and every member knew that a single mistake could mean the end. The leaders of the rival factions demanded absolute obedience. Their word was law, and questioning orders was considered a threat to the entire operation. Gang members were expected to keep secrets, report suspicious behavior, and follow through on violent tasks if required. Loyalty was tested constantly, especially as tensions rose between the factions. Any sign of weakness or disloyalty was crushed immediately to prevent cracks in their control. Family ties played a complicated role in this world. Many gang members were relatives or childhood friends, which made the betrayals even more painful. Sons followed fathers into the trade, learning early that loyalty was both a bond and a burden. Some families became infamous for their fierce protection of their own, while others fell apart when members turned against each other. Blood relations didn't always guarantee safety. Sometimes they made the betrayals even more shocking. The pressure to remain loyal forced some into impossible choices. Some men and women found themselves torn between family, friends, and survival. To stay alive, they had to hide secrets and play dangerous double games. A single misstep or slip of information could expose them to deadly consequences, not just from rivals but from their own gang. Within these violent circles, loyalty was rewarded with power, respect, and money. Those who proved themselves often rose through the ranks, gaining influence and control. But the higher one climbed, the greater the risk. Leaders became prime targets for rivals and law enforcement alike. Loyalty wasn't just about survival, it was about climbing the dangerous ladder of power. As the cocaine wars intensified, loyalty became the fragile glue holding the gangs together. But beneath the surface, suspicion and paranoia grew. In a world ruled by fear, trust was scarce, and betrayal was always waiting in the shadows. As the violence spiraled out of control, law enforcement realized that traditional policing wasn't enough to stop the cocaine trade in Liverpool. The gangs were too organized, too ruthless, and too deeply embedded in the city's fabric to fight back. Police launched undercover operations aimed at infiltrating the drug networks from the inside. These secret missions became some of the most dangerous and complex in Liverpool's recent history. Undercover officers disguised themselves as low-level dealers, buyers, or even gang members. They worked for months, sometimes years, building trust with criminals while carefully gathering evidence. Their goal was to uncover who controlled the shipments, how the drugs moved through the city, and who was responsible for the violent attacks. These missions required incredible patience and nerves of steel. One wrong move could cost them their lives. The gangs, however, were suspicious and constantly on alert. They ran their operations with military-like precision, using lookouts and secret codes to avoid detection. Paranoia grew within the groups as they knew informants or undercover agents could be lurking anywhere. Some gang members were arrested after brief encounters with police, but the main players remained elusive. Inside the police force, the situation was complicated by corruption. Some officers were tempted or threatened into turning a blind eye or passing information to criminals. This blurred the lines between law enforcement and the gangs, making the battle even harder. Honest officers faced not only violent criminals but also the challenge of rooting out corruption within their own ranks. Despite these difficulties, undercover work led to several major breakthroughs. High-profile arrests disrupted key parts of the cocaine supply chain, and some gang leaders were put behind bars. These successes showed that the gangs were not invincible, but the operations also stirred danger. Undercover agents became targets, and their identities had to be protected at all costs. The fight between police and gangs became a shadow war, one fought in silence, under cover of darkness, and closed doors. It was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where trust was scarce and every move carried life or death consequences. In this secret battle, both sides pushed harder than ever to gain the upper hand. The violence in Liverpool escalated to terrifying new heights, turning the city's streets into scenes of horror. What began as a struggle for control over cocaine territory soon unleashed a wave of bloodshed that affected not only gang members but innocent people caught in the middle. The once lively neighborhoods became places marked by fear and suspicion, where violence could erupt without warning. Drive-by shootings became alarmingly common, with gang members targeting rivals in public places. The blasts of gunfire shattered windows and silenced everyday life. Bombings were also used, often aimed at homes, businesses, or vehicles connected to rival gangs. These attacks were not just acts of revenge, they were warnings meant to intimidate and control. The message was clear: anyone standing in the way of the cocaine trade would face deadly consequences. The brutality didn't stop with gang members. Innocent bystanders, children, families, and elderly residents found themselves trapped in the crossfire. Schools and parks, places where safety was once guaranteed, became dangerous zones. Many families were forced to leave their homes, unable to risk their lives in the streets. The community was under siege, and the trauma of violence left deep scars. Public executions and brutal killings were designed to send the strongest possible message. These acts were carefully planned and carried out with cold precision. Bodies were left in public spaces, as grim reminders in a cycle of violence and crime. Rivalries between families were not just business disputes. They were old feuds, sometimes going back decades. Revenge and loyalty dictated many decisions, ensuring that peace was fragile and fleeting. The line between family and gang blurred, making it difficult to separate personal loyalty from criminal allegiance. In Liverpool's cocaine wars, family legacy was both a source of power and a prison. It shaped the violence and loyalty that defined the era, leaving a lasting impact on the city's streets and its people. Just as one faction seemed to be gaining the upper hand in Liverpool's cocaine wars, an unexpected and shocking betrayal sent the entire underworld into chaos. A trusted lieutenant, someone who had earned respect and held the confidence of their leaders, secretly began working with law enforcement. This double agent fed critical information to the police, exposing key players and major operations that had long seemed untouchable. The betrayal was a devastating blow to the gang that had counted on loyalty above all else. The revelation shattered trust within the ranks, as members began to suspect that anyone could be an informant. Paranoia spread quickly, leading to internal purges where even loyal members were questioned or eliminated in a desperate attempt to root out traitors. The gang's unity crumbled, weakening its hold on territory and power. What made this betrayal even more shocking was the mystery surrounding the double agent's motives. Some believed it was driven by revenge, perhaps a personal grudge against a leader or a response to a perceived betrayal. Others thought it was a desperate move to save a life, as many informants agreed to cooperate only when facing serious charges or threats. But there were darker rumors, whispers that the betrayal was part of a larger plan, orchestrated to weaken the gang from within for unknown reasons. The consequences rippled far beyond the betrayed faction. Rival gangs seized the opportunity to expand their control, exploiting the chaos and fractured leadership. Turf battles intensified as new alliances formed, and old enemies repositioned themselves. The streets, already stained with violence, became even more dangerous. For law enforcement, the betrayal was a breakthrough, but came at a cost. Protecting the double agent became a top priority, requiring constant vigilance and secrecy. The operation's success depended on keeping their moles safe from retaliation, but the risk of exposure was ever present. This shocking betrayal marked a turning point in Liverpool's cocaine wars. It showed that in a world ruled by fear and violence, trust was fragile, and sometimes the greatest enemy lurked inside. Years of relentless violence, arrests, and betrayals began to take their toll on Liverpool's cocaine empires. The once feared leaders who had ruled the streets with iron fists found themselves behind bars or dead, their power crumbling piece by piece. The fall of these giants created a power vacuum that sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. With the old guard removed, younger and more reckless criminals rose to fill the gaps. These new players lacked the experience, discipline, and respect commanded by their predecessors. Without strong leadership, gangs became more fragmented and unpredictable, leading to even more chaos on the streets. The carefully controlled empires fractured into smaller, volatile groups, each desperate to claim a piece of the drug trade. Law enforcement took advantage of the weakened gangs, pushing harder to dismantle what remained of the cocaine networks. Raids and arrests became more frequent, striking at the heart of the trade. The pressure from the police, combined with internal conflicts, further destabilized the factions. But despite these successes, the drug trade did not disappear. It adapted and changed, always finding new ways to survive. For many in Liverpool, the fall of the gang leaders brought a cautious hope. The brutal wars that had terrorized neighborhoods for years seemed to be winding down. Streets felt safer, and communities began to rebuild. But the wounds ran deep, and the city's scars were far from healed. Families who had lost loved ones, communities shattered by addiction and violence, faced years of recovery. At the same time, the new generation of criminals made it clear that the battle was far from over. They were younger, more ruthless, and often more unpredictable than those who came before. The old rules no longer applied, and the future of Liverpool's cocaine trade was uncertain. Would this new wave of criminals bring peace through new order, or plunge the city into even darker chaos? The fall of the giants marked the end of an era, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test Liverpool's resilience and determination to overcome its violent past. As the violence of the cocaine wars began to fade, Liverpool faced the daunting task of healing a city torn apart by years of bloodshed. Neighborhoods that had once been battlegrounds slowly started to rebuild, but the scars left by the conflict ran deep. Families mourned lost loved ones, and communities struggled to regain a sense of safety and trust that had been shattered. Local leaders, activists, and residents came together to confront the aftermath. Efforts to reclaim the streets involved more than just increased police presence. It required investing in the people and places most affected by the violence. Social programs aimed at providing education, job training, and support for young people became essential tools to prevent a new generation from falling into the same cycle of crime. Community centers, youth clubs, and outreach programs began to emerge, offering alternatives to the drug trade and gang life. These initiatives gave young people hope for a different future, one where they could dream beyond the limits of their neighborhoods. Schools focused on counseling and mentorship, recognizing that many students carried the weight of trauma and loss from the cocaine wars. At the same time, the city faced the challenge of addressing the widespread addiction that had accompanied the cocaine boom. Rehabilitation services expanded, and efforts were made to reduce the stigma around seeking help. Families affected by addiction found new resources to support recovery, helping to break the cycle that had fueled the drug trade for so long. Despite these positive steps, the legacy of the cocaine wars remained visible. Abandoned buildings and rundown neighborhoods served as reminders of the violent past. Trust between law enforcement and communities was still fragile, complicated by years of corruption and fear. For many, the wounds were not just physical but emotional and psychological. Liverpool's reckoning was far from complete. While progress had been made, the city knew that healing would take time and persistent effort. The story of the cocaine wars was a harsh lesson, but it also became a catalyst for change. The people of Liverpool showed resilience and determination to reclaim their city and their future from the shadows of the past. Though the most violent chapters of Liverpool's cocaine wars appeared to have ended, the story was far from over. Beneath the surface, the city's struggle with drugs, crime, and power continued in quieter but no less dangerous ways. New players began to emerge, some younger and more ruthless, others more cautious and strategic. The legacy of the past wars shaped their ambitions and methods, proving that the cycle of violence and control was difficult to break. The streets that had once been battlegrounds were still marked by the history of conflict. Old scars remained visible in graffiti, abandoned buildings, and whispered stories shared in neighborhoods. The families that had once ruled the trade either faded into obscurity or adapted, sometimes moving their operations underground or into different criminal enterprises. The drug trade, though less overt, persisted, still a source of wealth, danger, and influence. Law enforcement and community leaders remained vigilant, aware that the peace was fragile. They understood that the factors driving the cocaine wars, poverty, lack of opportunity, and social inequality, had not disappeared. Without continued effort and resources, the risk of a new wave of violence was always present. Preventative programs, better policing, and community engagement became crucial in holding the fragile calm. At the same time, the city grappled with its reputation. The international spotlight that had once shone on Liverpool's drug violence faded, but the impact lingered. Efforts to promote Liverpool as a vibrant, thriving city faced the challenge of overcoming the shadows cast by its violent past. The memory of the cocaine wars served as a reminder of what could happen when crime and desperation took hold. In many ways, Liverpool's story was a warning and a lesson, a reminder that power struggles over drugs and territory can tear a city apart. But it was also a story of resilience. The people who lived through the cocaine wars and their aftermath showed strength in rebuilding, refusing to let violence define their future. Liverpool's white lines and red streets still held secrets. The saga of the cocaine wars was paused, but not ended. New chapters awaited. Hidden in the city's corners,